Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to a program sponsored by the Middle East Institute. I see a lot of familiar faces, some of our members and language students and longtime supporters. Welcome again to one of our programs. There are some new faces, and for those of you who are new or who are not yet members, we'd like to encourage you to go online, mei.edu, sign up for membership. With your annual membership, you get 4 editions to the Middle East Journal, and you get to support programs, quality programs such as this and much more. So please do. We're really in for a treat this afternoon. This is the second in a series of programs on Afghanistan and Pakistan and those issues that affect every American that is sponsored by Lewis R. Hughes. Lou Hughes is currently CEO of N0 Corporation. He's an MEI board member, but more importantly, from 2004 to 2005, he served his nation in Kabul, in Afghanistan, as a chief of staff of the Afghan Reconstruction Program. He's got dust on his shoes. He knows what it's about, and we'd like to thank Lou for his service to his country. Lou, could you just stand up for a time? The distinguished speakers today will address the challenges and next steps facing the 2014 withdrawal of American and NATO combat troops from Afghanistan. After more of a decade of intense involvement in Afghanistan, the public supported the initial entry, but it also supports now turning over our operations to the Afghan government, Afghan security forces, and this will not come without enormous challenges and perils. Our panel today will discuss those. They have enormous expertise and experience in Afghanistan. Lieutenant General David R. Burno is a highly decorated military officer for over 30 years. In 2003, he took command of over 2,000 U.S. and coalition forces in Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. For 19 months, he held this position of the ultimate responsibility for overall military leadership of this complex political military operation, devising a highly complex counterinsurgency strategy in close partnership with coalition allies, including the Afghans. Michael O'Hanlon is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, where he specializes in U.S. defense strategy, the use of military force, and American foreign policy. Michael is a visiting lecturer at Princeton University. He's an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University. And O'Hanlon is also a member of the External Advisory Board of the CIA and is a frequent commentator on American and foreign media on military, but also extensively on Afghan issues. He's written several books. His latest book is co-authored with Martin Endyke and Kenneth Liebenthal, Bending History, Barack Obama's Foreign Policy. And our moderator is MEI's very own Dr. Marvin Weinbaum, who is currently a scholar in residence at the Middle East Institute. Marvin has had a long and successful career as a university professor at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. From 1999 to 2003, he served as an analyst at the State Department and the Intelligence and Research Bureau on Pakistan and Afghanistan. Marvin is the author or editor of over 6 books, hundreds of chapters and scholarly papers, and he also is a frequent guest with the media on panels and lecture forums such as this. So, Marvin, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Wendy. You know, there's one, with all the uncertainties in Afghanistan, we seem to have one near certainty, and that is that, as Wendy was alluding to, that we will see a drawdown, continue to see a drawdown of U.S. and allied forces over the next year and two-thirds. But with this certainty, there are a great many uncertainties. What's going to be the exact pace of that drawdown? We've had some hint in that. The President recently announced half as many forces as currently are their American forces will be on the ground or by early next year. We have still undecided, though, just what our relationship is going to be with Afghanistan. Will there be there is a strategic understanding, but will there really be a firmed-up agreement? That's still in negotiation. What will the terms of that be? And that will determine, of course, whether the U.S. Has any forces on the ground at all. But then, how many is yet to be determined. There's an election coming up a little bit more than a year in Afghanistan. How will that impact our withdrawal and our ability to sustain operations in the future there? There's going to be an election in Pakistan. What's going to happen in Pakistan over the next 18 months? And how will that impact? We've seen what happened when there was the closure of American supply routes, and now that we're so strongly dependent on Pakistan for the exit of at least our equipment. That's a factor we have to take into account. And then there are so many others, and some of them are really outliers. What would happen were there indeed a military confrontation with Iran, Afghanistan's next door neighbor? How might that affect the future of our presence in Afghanistan as we look at the end of 2014 and beyond? Well, as Wendy has already suggested, we could hardly do better than to have the two gentlemen we have with us today. They've already been introduced, and I'm just going to simply ask that Michael begin the discussion.
Thank you, Marvin. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy spring. Happy belated St. Patrick's Day, and I hope you're all doing well. I'm honored to be part of this discussion, and we'll try to get right at it. I'm going to begin with a little bit of my feel of Afghanistan from a trip last week. I was lucky enough to be on an ISAF-sponsored, a military-sponsored trip, but a lot of what we did was also talking with Afghan politicians, because politics is in the air in Afghanistan. That's going to be a big part of what I want to talk about today, although I'll begin with a little bit of a military update on what we also saw in our battlefield circulation, especially to Regional Command East and Regional Command South. I was on the trip with Michelle Flournoy, who had been Undersecretary of Defense, of course, with Ron Newman, former U.S. Ambassador to Afghanistan, and with two fellow think tank types, Steve Biddle and Tony Cordesman. And so we were there for about 10 days. Let me begin with a few factoids or thoughts on the military situation, and then, as I say, talk about politics. So I'll begin with sort of a situational report, and Dave Barno, I think, is going to perhaps go beyond that, maybe begin to get us into a policy debate, and then we'll look forward, of course, to your discussions and questions as well. On the military front, first of all, as you know, and today I think I should have also said Happy New Year, because this is tomorrow is the beginning of the Afghan New Year, and it's roughly the beginning of the fighting season, not officially set to a calendar, but more or less set meteorologically to the warmer weather, and you all know this, and people are expecting things to get more intense. In the time I was in Afghanistan, there was a car bomb that greeted Secretary Hagel on his visit. There was a bigger car bomb defused by some good work by the Afghans and NATO working together near Kabul. And there were other suggestions of a ramping up of the effort. We visited Regional Command South, where it already is spring, down in Kandahar. And let me begin with that, because in a way it was the most surprising single thing I saw on the trip, and probably also the most encouraging. So you're not going to get a lot of happy talk from me today, but most of what I have to say about the South actually is encouraging. I was struck in the in the trip there, and I think, although you'll be hearing from them, I'm sure, in other fora in the coming days, most of my colleagues were struck as well by the degree of progress. When I say progress, I do not mean that the Taliban is necessarily being defeated. You all know that starting 10 years ago with General Barno, or even before that, and then continuing thereafter, we've been after the Taliban for a long time, and we've had a lot more resources with which to do it in the last 3 or 4 years. But unfortunately, this enemy has proven very resilient. And no one doubts that, no one questions that in theater. There are different interpretations about just how strong, just how confident the Taliban is. But unfortunately, their sanctuaries in Pakistan are largely unmitigated. The Pakistanis haven't done much about that. Even as we've killed and captured a lot of mid-level commanders in the field, the shadow governors and the Quetta Shura, as well as the Peshawar Shura, have remained safe in their cities just over the border. The degree of unemployment and anti-Americanism, especially in Pakistan, has been so strong that there are ample recruits to replace those who have been taken off the battlefield. And so no one really argues that the Taliban is being defeated, or for that matter, even much degraded. There is some debate about that, but I don't think we can really view the enemy as fundamentally weaker than it was several years ago. And therefore, the original goal of 3-4 years ago with the McChrystal Review, at least one of the original goals, has not been met, I think it's fair to say. We have not defeated or even substantially weakened the enemy. However, a second best outcome has been increasingly evident and was really visible to me on this trip. The Afghan forces are coming up to par on being able to accept the baton from us as we transfer to them, and they are looking better and better. Now, in fairness, they haven't been adequately tested yet, and this is going to be a big year, because the big story of this year's campaign plan, which is about to be put into effect, is that it was written by Afghans, and there's a reason why it was written primarily by Afghans with our advice. It's because they're going to do most of the hard work. So you've probably all heard statistics that improved substantially under General Allen's watch, which of course just ended last month, that the Afghans were leading 85% of all security operations even before he had left. And that's all true, but the majority, the preponderance of those operations were simple patrols. And we were often close by or able to reinforce. And frankly, the clearing operations going after difficult sanctuaries inside Afghanistan of the Taliban, we, the NATO forces, tended to lead, even as recently as last year. This is the first year when any additional clearing is really going to require Afghan lead responsibility. And of course, President Karzai has made this even more evident by making it harder for us to support Afghan forces with his concern over civilian casualties, his objections to some of our air raids and various kinds of operations, our presence in the villages. All that remains very unsettled and problematic, and it's going to put even more pressure on the Afghan forces this year. So the big news about the battle plan is the Afghans are going to be in the lead. But in Kandahar, where again we spent one day and went to a number of sites in the field, the overall story is really rather encouraging when you think of Kandahar as being in many ways the epicenter of the fight. The story is not quite as happy in the east, but in the south you have a 2/3 reduction in violence by most metrics. There's a lot of debate about which metrics are meaningful, if any, but basically all of them show a 1/2 to 2/3 reduction in violence in the south. You have Kandahar city thriving, really bustling with schools, with markets, much, much better than I would have expected. The Ahmed Wali Karzai network that, of course, had so concerned us when he was alive through 2011 has essentially been replaced by a splintering of networks, or a number of networks now. And I don't want to say that the corruption problem has been fundamentally mitigated. I don't see any evidence of that. But the good news is that if you think of our economic role as trying to essentially play off different tribes and keep many of them happy simultaneously, we're in a better place than we were 2 years ago, because Ahmed Wali Karzai, being one particular Populzai type of Pashtun and being in command of so many of the resources in the south, bred resentment by his tribal rivals. Now you have the spoils being shared more widely. I'm not sure we're doing a better job with development. I'm not sure we're doing a better job with anti-corruption, but we are almost accidentally doing a better job spreading the riches more widely. And that's getting more buy-in. Now, just what's going to happen as we reduce our economic and military presence is another matter, but I think as long as we keep pumping a fair amount of aid into Afghanistan and the politics play the way they are, the South looks relatively good even on that front. But militarily, what we also are seeing is the Afghan army, police, and local police collaborating. And so what you'll have, for example, which I don't think we had too much in Dave Barno's day, when he was struggling to even have a small shell of an Afghan army and police effective, we have a 350,000 strong force nationwide. And what you're seeing is when commanders get in trouble, they're now knowing to call for reinforcements. They're getting the reinforcements. They're getting the idea they've got to help each other. Last winter, we stopped providing them with their logistics supplies. We made them do it while we were still there to rescue them in a crisis. They're doing that now. Still big problems with their whole requisition system, with their resupply, but they're actually working their own chain of command to get their fuel, get their ammunition. It's going to be harder once we're gone, no doubt, because they're going to have to do that without as much of our technology. And even if we keep 10 or 12,000 forces in Afghanistan after 2014, as I hope we will, we're not going to have enough to do a lot of the route clearance, the routine help in logistical resupply or enabling, but they're showing an ability, an initial ability to do much more of that. So I could give you a couple of more anecdotes and discussion, but the main story of the South, less violent, less corrupt in the sense of at least one less prominent figurehead taking everything his way and angering other tribes, even if the corruption is still there in a more sort of equal way, a more fair way. And then finally, the Afghan security forces really collaborating much better than they had before. And much larger, 50+ thousand just in the South, as we've now reduced our forces there by a third. So the handoff is beginning. The operations are shifting. Afghans are taking 3/4 of the casualties. Afghans are running 85% of the operations. Afghans wrote the 2013 campaign plan, and now Afghans are going to be executing many of the clearing operations that will continue from this point onward. That's an overall military lay of the land. Let me just say one thing about the East. We spent a little less time in the East than in the South, but nonetheless, the story of the East is it's a much more mixed picture. We never had the forces that General McChrystal requested. General Barno would have probably loved to have even a fraction of all the forces being discussed in the McChrystal review. But as you know, President Obama did not approve all the forces that McChrystal had wanted back in 2009, and then President Obama accelerated the drawdown partially, somewhat, in 2011. So the East never got all the forces that a proper counterinsurgency strategy would have required. But some people in the American command in the East said that's okay, because what we're seeing now is the Afghans are actually able to do more of this, and we have to push them to do more of the clearing sooner than we would have perhaps otherwise been inclined. And we have enough forces to sort of come to their help and their assistance in the interim if they need it. There are two major Afghan corps commands in the East, the 201st and the 203rd. The 201st, by all reports, up around Jalalabad and points north, is very, very good and showing increasing initiative. They have a fairly substantial campaign plan. I got to see some of the details. I won't spill the beans in an unclassified setting, but let me just say it's fairly detailed and it's fairly significant, and it involves going on the offensive a fair amount and linking up the Army with the police, with local police that they want to create in the sort of in the wake of their clearing operations to continue to secure territory once they try to rid it of sanctuaries or weapons caches of the Taliban. We'll see how that goes, but people are impressed by the initiative of the 201st Corps Commander and his forces. The 203rd, which is further down south in what you might call the P2K area, Paktika Host, this has a little further to go. The good news is we've made some inroads along Ghazni, just to the west of these provinces on the Kandahar-Kabul road. Last year's fighting season allowed us to do some of that work with Afghan assistance. This year the tables, as I say, are turning. The Afghans are going to be more in the lead, and we'll see how they do. But by all accounts, we see progress in the 201st Corps, at least some limited progress with the 203rd Corps, a long ways to go. Again, this year is going to be a day of reckoning, or a season of reckoning for the Afghan security forces. And any kind of provisional good news that people were encouraged by is going to have to remain very provisional until we see what happens over the next 6 months or so. That's a very, very quick once-over on some of the battlefield trends. Let me now talk very briefly about politics, and of course we can talk about that all day, so I'll just tee up a couple of key points. Obviously, during the time that we were there, it was also a tough time in our relationship with President Karzai, and I'm sure a lot of Americans are wondering what the devil is going on with this guy's thinking. Leslie Gelb, in a piece last week, was even less restrained in what he said his opinions were. I won't repeat for primetime TV the kind of language in that op-ed, but nonetheless, a lot of Americans probably share it. How can Karzai act like, or not act like an ally when he's got tens of thousands of American forces serving his country, and yet he treats us as if at times we're in collaboration with the Taliban, one of the things he said, or trying to push us out of the villages before we can really get the job done there, implying that our forces are unnecessary or cavalier in how they use force and the way they sometimes cause civilian casualties, even though we're down to causing only a couple of hundred civilian casualties per year, which is incredible by the standards of war, by the way. I mean, in Vietnam, we caused probably hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties per year. In this war, it's hundreds. and far less than the Taliban are causing intentionally. And we're trying to reduce that more and more, and yet what Karzai does is emphasize whatever mistakes or problems occur as if they somehow typify the situation. Okay, what's in Karzai's head? Dave Barno probably knows him better than I do. I did see him last week. I won't talk specifically about that meeting in our group, but I would say the following, that I think Karzai, first of all, is not a great military strategist. And what he sees is a war that's been much longer and slower and more frustrating than he expected. And he's wondering how this great NATO alliance, with all these great commanders and all these great troops and 50 countries in the coalition, can somehow be stymied in a 12-year war against a bunch of ragtag Taliban with AK-47s and plastic sandals living up in the hills. So he assumes that if we're not winning, we must not want to win. Now, that's an unfortunate conclusion that he reaches, but you can sort of half understand how he gets there. And that gets his conspiracy theories going about why else we want to be in Afghanistan. Do we want bases to be able to project into Asia or attack Iran? How does he bargain with us knowing that we want these bases? That's the kind of stuff that gets into his head because he's so frustrated by the military campaign. You know, I'm sure, again, Dave knows him better than I and can speak more if he wishes about what drives Karzai, but I find him a fascinating person in that he is obviously a gracious person and in many ways, I think, sincere, but also capable of being petty and capable of being totally insensitive and underappreciative, and all those things at once. So after 12 years in the presidency, or 11 years, which is way too long for anybody to be in charge of a war, the way Karzai's been, he shows the strains and the signs of fatigue, and he lashes out. He gets frustrated, and he goes off his talking points, and he says something like, well, the U.S. must be in cahoots with the Taliban to keep this war going so they can keep their bases, so they can keep an eye on Pakistan and have a capability near China, Russia, and Iran. That's the way he thinks. It's unfortunate. It's not correct. But to some extent, there is a non-crazy logic to it, and we're going to have to just muddle through this next year with Karzai, because maybe I should just quickly finish up on the following point, since there's lots more to say and I don't want to go on too long, but we only should have one more year left with this gentleman. Across Kabul, across the country, whenever we met with politicians, NGO leaders, others, educators, media, everybody expects the election to happen, including Karzai himself. There's always a chance he'll change his mind and declare martial law or convene a loya jirga and try to suspend the articles of the Constitution that require him to step down next year. But I don't think he will. I think what he'll try to do instead, and we heard a lot of this talk, is find his preferred candidate, not unlike the way an incumbent American president would potentially try to support his party's would-be successor. Of course, Karzai will use a few more tools and tricks than we typically do in our political system to add to the mix. But the good news is Afghanistan has a lot of independent media. It has a lot of international oversight, and I think there's a good chance that we can keep pressure on Karzai to allow a free and fair, or at least tolerably credible election. And Karzai is, I think, right now trying to figure out, he didn't say this to us, but everybody else assumes, he's trying to figure out who to anoint as his preferred successor, and then to try to build a coalition and a ticket that would be multi-ethnic. Because one thing you got to give Karzai credit for, he has tried to be multi-ethnic throughout his presidency. And plus, you can't win an election in Afghanistan unless you get a lot of Tajik votes. Tajiks are 25% of the population, and it's a safer part of the country, so the voter turnout is higher. So you really need a Tajik strong presence on your ticket. There are some ugly scenarios that could come out of this. Fahim Khan, for example, the first vice president, if he were to win, he's a Tajik, he could even win. He's corrupt, he's Tajik, he would provoke a lot of anti-Pakistani, or a lot of anti-Taliban, slow down, Mike, a lot of anti-Afghan behavior by the Pakistanis, because if he became the president of the country as a Tajik, the Pakistanis would probably see red and decide they want to go after him, weaken him, do even more to hurt our campaign than they're doing. There are scenarios by which someone like that could wind up either Karzai's preferred choice or somehow the person that emerges. We've got to work very hard, I think, to send Afghans the message that if it's someone like Fahim Khan, There's no way we're going to provide $4, $5, $6 billion a year in aid. There's no way all the Tokyo pledges and Chicago pledges from last year are going to be met. We've got to insist on a certain minimal level of credibility and competence in whoever replaces Karzai, as well as a process that is minimally transparent. And that raises more questions than it answers, so I won't go on right now, just maybe to tee up that for further discussion. But let me say in conclusion, again, military situation, slightly encouraging. Not because the Taliban is necessarily weaker, but because the Afghan security forces are much better, showing the initiative, showing a lot more capability. The handoff process is only beginning, but it's encouraging so far. The politics are the big $64,000 question. The wrong kind of dynamic could, I think, jeopardize all the progress on the security front and make this Afghan army even at risk of collapsing or fracturing along ethnic lines, could certainly jeopardize the international community's willingness to support Afghanistan. And so increasingly, I think our eyes are going to have to turn towards the politics of Afghanistan. And we have to avoid, my final thought, we have to avoid overcompensating for 2009. In 2009, the international community browbeat Karzai, tried to develop other candidates, tried to make the elections more open, tried to insist on a runoff. I don't blame Ambassador Holbrooke or others who tried to do that, but the way it was read by Karzai and his cronies is they're trying to take us down, created a lot of animosity with Karzai, and it never changed the outcome anyway. And therefore, the international community this time around is tending to overcompensate and overlearn the lessons of 2009, pull back, not want to touch the politics very much at all, not want to get into these messy issues of who can we really live with and who won't we happily live with, because that sounds like an infringement on Afghan sovereignty. But if the Afghans have the sovereign right to choose their own president, we have the sovereign right to decide where to pump $5 and $6 and $10 billion a year of our own money and ask maybe 10,000 Americans to serve on an indefinite, long-term, post-ISAF mission. So there are sovereign rights for both sides, and we've got to be willing, I think, to exercise some limited leverage over these elections because they're so important. Thanks for your patience.
Well, thanks, Marvin, and thanks, Mike, for a great update on where we stand today in terms of our role in Afghanistan. In some ways, we could perhaps characterize our sets of remarks here as today, tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow. And I'm going to focus mostly on tomorrow and the day after. Mike, I think, has given a tour de force run through of today, and with some implications for tomorrow and longer term. But I'll focus a bit on the broader perspective, I think. I would highlight, before I start, maybe three folks in the audience who I've spent a lot of time in my previous life with in Afghanistan. Lou Hughes, who was mentioned already, who was the head of the Afghan Reconstruction Group, a group of American senior business executives that came essentially at zero cost to the government to Kabul for a year apiece to work with the Afghan ministries back in my era, 03, 04, 05. Sitting next to him up here, just joined us, Patrick Fine, who is the director of USAID during the second part of my tour in Afghanistan. And Marty Hoffman here, former Secretary of the Army, who ran the Afghan Reach-Back Office here in the Pentagon. For both Lou and for Patrick, I was sitting here thinking I spent more time with these two individuals than I spent with most of the officers on my staff during my 19 months in Afghanistan, which tells you something interesting about the nature of our effort back then and how we approached the challenge. That probably couldn't be said by too many folks, I don't think, before or after me in command there. So looking a bit at the broader picture, and I want to start with the strategic context, because we often approach Afghanistan, I think, here as a very in-depth, mile-deep discussion, inch-wide, on the island of Afghanistan and the U.S. relationship with the island of Afghanistan. And of course, not only is Afghanistan not an island geographically, it's also connected to a much broader security context for the United States, which is becoming more and more impactful to our decision-making as we reach what I might call the end game in Afghanistan. So the broader strategic context, if we look at the massive amount of change that the United States writ large has been in the midst of just over the last 5 years or so, since 2008, we're clearly in a very different place globally today. We're in a different place economically today. We're moving to some different places in our global strategy and our security capabilities. We're coming out of, we hope, the deepest, worst recession since the Depression. We're running trillion-dollar deficits times the last 4 years and approaching that here for the coming year. And we're looking at, in the Defense Department, some very significant cuts from the sequestration legislation that are likely to continue in some fashion for the next 9 years. So within that broader context, we're going to be making decisions about our future role in Afghanistan. I think it's important to recognize that big picture before we start necking down into the small picture. I would emphasize in that, and I'm not fresh back from Afghanistan, but I'm fresh back from another conflict, House Armed Services testimony on the Hill here about 2 weeks ago, and I was counting in my on my notepad that was the 13th time I've testified on the Hill in the last 5 years on Afghanistan, Pakistan, Al-Qaeda. Rather striking. And so I've been able to stay very involved with this. I've taken several trips back, had family members there much more recently than that. And so, you know, I've got a personal stake in the outcome here. So as I continue to watch this evolve, I have many clashing personal feelings about this as well as my professional outlook. But I'll try and share a bit of both of those here today. As we move forward in this fiscally constrained context that I'm describing, we're in the midst of a global strategic review that's on the heels of the new strategic guidance we put out last year for the Defense Department, and a lot of that's going to be driven by finances. And I think that's going to come to play in ways in Afghanistan that we can't lose sight of as we look at decision making in the coming years. So I think I would first go back to, as we look to not only what maybe tomorrow, which would be between now and the end of 14, but the day after tomorrow, which is what is our long-term presence going to be in Afghanistan after 2014. The president has described in numerous speeches in his terms the fact that war for Americans is going to end at the end of 2014. We're seeking right now to reach an agreement with the Afghan government on a long-term presence of some sort in Afghanistan. But what's that long-term presence all about, and what's going to drive the necessity for having that, and what's the prospects for that actually going to occur? And Mike alluded to this a little bit in terms of some of the future options, which I'm going to drill down to in a bit more detail. Well, I would go back to making the argument about U.S. vital interests in this region. And again, not the island of Afghanistan, but the broader region of South and Central Asia that Afghanistan sits very much in the middle of, is a crossroads of. And if we look at that broader region, I think most people would agree that it's one of the top 2 or 3 most dangerous regions in the world. So not only do we have Afghanistan, which was the jumping off spot for the 9/11 attacks, but next door in Pakistan, we have a country of 180 million people compared to 30 million in Afghanistan. We have a country that's the second largest Islamic country in the world. It'll be the largest Islamic country in the world by mid-century, with about 300 million Pakistanis, and today has somewhere north of 100 nuclear weapons. It's locked in a protracted Cold War with its neighbor India, which has 1.1 billion people, which is an increasingly important American partner in the region, also armed with up to 100 nuclear weapons. As we look at the northern stands on the northern tier of Afghanistan, we see several states, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, that are struggling with internal unrest and also struggling for their place in the region. And of course, to the west, we have Iran, that's seeking a nuclear weapon and is involved in very contentious relationships with its neighbors, as being a very, to be generous, unhelpful nation state in Southwest Asia. So this is a volatile, dangerous region. That in and itself makes an argument for some sustained American military presence, I would suggest, in Afghanistan. But again, taking this back to vital interests, I think there's only about 3 that I would articulate as we look at this region for the U.S. that are accurate today, that are going to be true tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. The first of those is that the United States is going to need to prevent further terrorist attacks from this part of the world on the United States or our allies. Again, that takes us back to why we're in Afghanistan. The 9/11 attacks emanated from a sanctuary, a safe haven for Al-Qaeda, that the U.S. really hadn't done much to disrupt in the previous years. We're not going to permit that situation to occur again. And we're going to be, I think, fairly assertive in ensuring that we don't have terrorist safe havens that can reach out and touch the United States develop in the aftermath of our drawdown in Afghanistan. So that's number one. You could call that counterterrorism. Number two in our vital interest portfolio, I would say, would be preventing the spread of nuclear weapons or nuclear materials from falling into the hands of terrorists in this region. And again, Afghanistan, of course, has no nuclear weapons, so we're looking more broadly as we seek to ensure the security of the nuclear weapons that are in the region and to prevent the most horrific outcome we can imagine is having some of those fall into the hands of terrorists. That's, in a sense, a counter-proliferation project for us. The third vital interest I think we have is to prevent and help really divert from happening a nuclear war between India and Pakistan. These are the two only nuclear-armed countries in the world that are actually locked in some degree of perpetual conflict. They've come to the brink of nuclear war several times. This is extraordinarily dangerous. It's not replicated anywhere else in the world. It has got to be a focus of our regional interests. So as we begin now to think about Afghanistan, I think it's important for us to view our future presence in Afghanistan through that lens. And as we continue to make the case here in Washington and throughout the United States and throughout other nations that are our allies around the world for support for Afghanistan, those interests in many ways replicate the interests of the international community. And I think that's extremely important because making the argument on Capitol Hill, making the argument in Boise, Idaho, or in Mountain Home, Wyoming, that we need to continue to have troops in Afghanistan and send billions of dollars to Afghanistan for humanitarian reasons is not going to sell in 2017, 2019, 2022, 2024. A vital interest argument to protect the interests of the United States and our allies is much more solid ground. And I don't hear that argument as much as I think needs to be made. So I would kind of frame the big picture in that way, that we have vital interests to protect, that our decisions that lead now to what happens after 2014 will either support those vital interests, allow us to continue to protect those essentials, or they'll put them at risk. So what are some of the options for us as we look ahead in terms of our strategy in the coming years? And I'll look perhaps now to post-2014 a bit. Right now I see three broad options out there under debate. And of course we know the essential troop drawdown numbers between now and 2014. And Michael alluded to those. We're going to take about 34,000 out this year, dropping the force down to about 32,000 by around this time next year. There's an election in April of 2014. That troop presence of 32K will probably stay through that, but then begin to draw down to we don't know what comes next exactly. The president has not yet made, or at least not yet announced, that decision. So what happens after 2014? I think three broad possibilities there. One is that we'll have a very robust military presence, and this has been called, and I would define that as something north of 10,000 Americans and 5,000 or so other NATO forces, something in the collective region of perhaps 15 to 20,000. That's very much the high end today. We've heard some indications of the CENTCOM commander testified recently he thought there should be 13,600 Americans left in Afghanistan after 2014. Chairman McKeon from the HASC has just come back from Afghanistan and quoted the ambassador, our ambassador and our commander there, saying that's the number. I'm sure they were surprised to read that in the newspaper when they got up that following morning. They were. But I'm sure you were there when that happened. So that, in a sense, I think is the high end of what we're looking at. Very robust presence, has second and third order effects in terms of how the Afghan government looks at that, how the Afghan people look at that, how the Pakistanis look at that, that may not be entirely helpful to our interests. The second tranche, if you will, of options, I'd say would fall in the American forces between, let's say, 5,000 and 10,000. Fairly modest-sized presence with another, 3,000 to 5,000 NATO forces. The ratio between Americans and other NATO troops is going to roughly, we think, be around 2 to 1. 2 Americans for every other 1 NATO soldier that remains in Afghanistan after 2014. That's our kind of business rule of thumb argument right now. So that would entail a total force somewhere in the neighborhood of 8,000 to 12,000 perhaps collectively. Again, mission set, counterterrorism. Our primary mission, some degree of counterproliferation, and there's also a mission set there of continuing to advise and provide some very limited support to Afghan security forces. Finally, the last option, which I actually wrote about back in January to to highlight to President Karzai that it is an option I call the zero option. That's no Americans in Afghanistan after 2014, a similar situation that we found ourselves in today in Iraq. There's about 220 U.S. military personnel in Iraq today, not 10,000, not 20,000, 220, and they're all under the mission, under the U.S. Embassy there, under diplomatic immunity through the embassy. That is an alternative outcome for Afghanistan. That is not a desirable outcome, I don't think, for Afghanistan. It's not one I would suggest or propose, but it's very important that President Karzai understand that, the Afghan people understand that, and that is a possibility that the United States could make that decision. Primarily driven by lack of diplomatic immunity for American forces. If we find ourselves in the same position in Afghanistan at the end of 2014 that we found ourselves in Iraq, that we had no agreement for the diplomatic immunity of American soldiers that were going to remain there, those American soldiers, ladies and gentlemen, are coming home. And they're coming home very rapidly, just like they did at the end of 11 in Iraq. So that is a viable course of action. It's, in a sense, a worst-case course of action, but it's certainly one that I think could happen if we fail to reach agreement with the Afghans. And most importantly, I think President Karzai needs to recognize that possibility. So let me just close by talking a little bit about the risks coming up. And I see three areas of obvious risk, in my view, over the next several years. And the first of those really surrounds the transitions that are happening next year. The three risk areas there are the political transition, which Michael talked to, the April 2014 election. We don't know who's going to run. We don't know what role President Karzai is going to play. We don't know the degree of legitimacy that in the aftermath will be associated with that election. If that election is as badly executed as the one in 2009, if it's viewed as illegitimate by the international community or by the Afghan people, we have an immense problem, and it'll be very difficult to argue for any kind of sustained presence in the aftermath of that outcome in Afghanistan. So that would be a very dark outcome for us. The economic transition in the same period, we're going to be pulling significant amount of dollars, euros, and yens out of the Afghan economy. Their economy is inflated with around 12 or 13% growth rate over recent years. Economists suggest that'll drop it to a 5% growth rate, which sounds great until you see what that looks like at the village, province, district level in Afghanistan, that have been dependent upon this aid and development money and military money for many years. So there's some instability that I'm concerned about in that economic transition. And finally, the military transition, which we talk incessantly about, which I actually think is the less important of the transitions in many ways. If we have a failed political transition and or a failed economic transition, the military transition is incidental. But again, as Michael noted, the critical node there is the viability of the Afghan National Security Forces. And fortunately, finally, after tugging, pushing, pulling, shouting, and various arm wrestling for the last 3 years, the ISAF forces, the NATO forces, are moving to make their main effort for this year the success of the Afghan National Security Forces. I think about 2 years later than they should have. But this is critical now, and if the Afghan security forces, the Army, the police, the National Director of Security, if they can't pick up the cudgel and continue the fight against the Taliban and do so in their own way, but do so with at least a modest degree of effectiveness, keeping their forces coherent, and having moderate battlefield success in what's really a defensive fight, then if they're unable to do that, then we again have a very significant problem on our hands out there. Perhaps in the Q&A we can go into talking a bit about some lessons learned over the last 12 years. You know, I noted, as many of you did this morning, we're now reaching the crescendo in the next few days of the 10-year anniversary of the start of the war in Iraq. And we're beginning to pull out all of our lessons learned from the Iraq War and have all kinds of prognostication on that. It's ironic and painful to realize the Afghan War started 18 months before the war in Iraq, and the Afghan War continues 18 months after we've come out of Iraq. And that future is going to continue to move forward with that war underway. So I think talking about that a little bit probably has some merit. But for the sake of time, let me pause there, and I look forward very much to your questions. Thank you.
We've been very fortunate in having two presentations, one clearly a macro view of Afghanistan and what we're facing, and the other more micro, and they complement one another so very well. Allow me to raise the first question, and we've got here so much to digest that there are really so many questions I know that you're going to want to ask. One term that was not used this afternoon was reconciliation, political reconciliation. Didn't come up at all. When we think of that these days, we've been thinking about it in terms of somehow reaching some political solution, which includes the main body of the Taliban. Should we dismiss that now as part of the equation? And if we do, is there reconciliation nevertheless that's important in terms of, does there have to be political reconciliation within Afghanistan in order to have a favorable outcome? What role is that going to play? If that fails to take place, what then can we anticipate? Gentlemen?
A couple of quick thoughts. My impressions were that most people are pessimistic about the prospects for reconciliation, partly because they see the Taliban as confident. Taliban feels it's doing okay, and that it's going to do better as we draw down. Also, there's a great deal of feeling that, of course, the Taliban remains the same as always, and therefore can't be reconciled with, because its ideology is fundamentally at odds with what Afghans want, what most Afghans want. And of course, this has to do with many of the same concerns we have in the West about women's rights, minority rights, religious rights, and so forth. And I didn't hear much dissension from anybody on that basic prognosis. But there is a debate, as there has been for quite a while, about whether we should try anyway to negotiate. And of course, the argument is, first of all, the assessment that I just gave could be wrong, and the Taliban may surprise us. They may be tired of living in Pakistan. They may be tired, and there even are some reports that there are ideas about trying to get at the Taliban in Pakistan, not so much by us, but by others, and I'll leave it at that. But to the extent that people in Quetta were worried about their own personal security or worried about their kids growing up in Pakistan and not being treated very nicely by a group that tolerates them and uses them but doesn't really welcome them in complete sense, maybe the Taliban would like to do a peace deal, or at least some fraction of them. And if we could split off some fraction and maybe get them to lay down their arms or just have a large personal security detail, give them some governorships in certain districts in the east, maybe give a couple of them relatively lesser important ministry positions, maybe you could at least pick off a few of the local leaders. But that's about as hopeful as I heard, because again, you have this fundamental divide. The last point I'll make, and then look forward to Dave's thoughts, is where I think we have done a quite poor job is in working together with President Karzai on a reconciliation strategy, because you hear as much internal dissent within the alliance as you do anything else when this subject comes up. We don't trust Karzai, he doesn't trust us, Tajiks don't trust him. It's a mess. And at a minimum, we should be able to go into this with some clear set of initial understandings about what kind of a deal we could probably accept and what the preconditions are for getting to talks. The idea that this should be dividing us from Karzai when we have enough other problems with him is a little frustrating. And so I think that, frankly, we've got to think of a better way, not just stay bogged down in this issue of whether 5 released prisoners should go to Qatar and start negotiations there, but maybe spell out a little bit more of our principles for these talks. And I would just suggest 2 of them. One is that the talks are ultimately going to be Afghan-run. We're only going to be able to support or catalyze these talks. Karzai or his successor would have to do a deal. And we should acknowledge and accept that more vocally. And then secondly, the core rights of the Afghan people have to be respected in any deal. And so, yes, we can negotiate with Taliban who are willing to accept much of the Afghan constitution as it is, but on certain basic issues of not using violence, being willing to still have, I think we have to stay firm on some of these basic points. And if we would, we've been generally firm, but sometimes we dance around about what our red lines are. I think maybe having some people spell out a plausible deal. Maybe academics should do it more than the government, but we should basically say, listen, we can't imagine an Afghan constitution that tramples on women's rights. There will be no such deal. But there could be a deal in which some of the districts in the east have former Taliban governors who have some autonomy in that region, provided that they are at least paying some lip service to the Constitution, limiting their militias, accepting some degree of supervision by Kabul. And that's the kind of deal we could imagine. I think a little bit of clarity on that front could assuage some concerns.
Yeah, just a few brief additional thoughts. Yeah, I'm probably an outlier on this, but I actually think the U.S. role and the U.S. equities in this are diminishing day by day. That we have 21 months worth of interest in that particular issue, a negotiated settlement. Next month it's 20 months, and then it continues to go down. And I think the Taliban know that, the Afghan government knows that, Afghan people know that. This is ultimately, as Mike suggested, going to be an Afghan to Afghan discussion. The U.S. can help facilitate that. The U.S. can't drive it. The U.S. is not a counterparty to the talks, will not be able to be. It's not in our interest, I don't think, personally, to do that. And I think at the end of the day, the Afghans are going to have to figure this out. And it will be catalyzed most of all by the large-scale departure of international forces at the end of 2014. Then it's a new game. It's a new discussion. It's a new government in Kabul as well, in the palace, from the Karzai government. And the conditions are, I think, much more likely to result in some kind of Afghan v. Afghan solution after December 2014.
Thank you. The reason that I had brought up reconciliation among the Afghans themselves is one of my observations, and others too, is the extent to which the Afghans are concerned here about reaching some kind of consensus among themselves, particularly on the political dimension. And what would happen if, for example, they began, as a result perhaps of the election, fighting among one another, and what that would, consequences that would mean for everything else. It's very clear to me that one of the perhaps a bright spot here is that almost unanimously among the people who you speak to, there's an enormous fear of chaos in the country, a fear that that they could go back to the years 92 to 96 when they had a civil war which tore the country apart, far more destructive than any other period of time. It is the nightmare of most Afghans. And with that in mind, that might be the strongest driver toward getting them to reach some kind of understanding among themselves, if nothing else, to accept the results of that next election, whoever prevails. Please, questions. Max. Do we have a mic? Please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Max Gross. I'm teaching over at the Foreign Service Institute. My question is going to provoke just an answer that can only be speculative. But given that the situation in 2003 in Afghanistan is so different than the situation in 1994 when the Taliban came to power, at that time they came as kind of saviors. There's no one that perceives them as saviors today except possibly themselves. Do you think it's possible that the Taliban can reemerge?
Well, I'm not sure how you would define re-emerge. They might already argue they have re-emerged. I would interpret that as, do I think the Taliban can seize Kabul and take over the country again? No, I don't. It's almost impossible for me to conceive circumstances where that would happen. And we ought to remind ourselves as well that the Taliban and the Northern Alliance were at war in September 2001 before the 9/11 attacks, and the Taliban had driven the Northern Alliance forces back into two fairly small enclaves in the northern part of Afghanistan. So the country was still contested at that point in time. I don't even think that's a likely outcome, frankly. I think that the reality was that same Taliban in 2001 fighting the same Northern Alliance of 2001 in the space of 3 months was thrown out of the country by simply adding 400 Americans and some air power. So I think if any of that capability is available to the Afghan government in the out years, I think any prospects for the Taliban taking over the country are near zero. So, and as you suggested as well, I used to joke when I was there, the Afghans have been there, they got the T-shirt, they don't want the Taliban back. They've lived that dream, they don't want to go back to that in almost all parts of the country. So there's a pretty significant inoculation against that still among the population.
If I could just add a point, I certainly agree with the spirit and the thrust of what Dave just said, but I'm a little more nervous. I could imagine a couple of scenarios that I don't expect, do not consider the most likely, but let me just lay out a couple of them. One is where you get the wrong Tajik to win. And I don't think this is crazy. I mean, I mentioned Fahim Khan. It would be a very bad outcome. But, you know, the Tajiks, as you're well aware, constitute 25% of the population and probably had twice the turnout of the South, percentage-wise, in the last election. In other words, Karzai won with a lot of Tajik as well as Hazara and Uzbek votes. Exactly. So Karzai is a master at trying to put together that kind of a coalition, and he'll certainly try that for whoever he deems to be his preferred successor. But it's possible that many Tajiks will not like the new coalition and will stick together. And even if they elect a relatively competent Tajik, it'll be an open question whether the country accepts that, and also whether the Pakistanis accept that. And so you could imagine a civil war. I don't think it's very likely. I put it in the single-digit percentages that you would get a civil war, but I can't dismiss it. Secondly, you could have a poor candidate, a poor Pashtun candidate elected, and then you have the sense the international community pulls back a bit. Let's say it's Daoudzai, you know, one of Karzai's former chiefs of staff who's got strong pro-Iranian associations and is probably more corrupt than Karzai himself personally, someone like that. And if that kind of a person won, then I think you have a likely reduction in international aid and presence, maybe a 50%, 75% cut relative to what's currently programmed. And then the possibility that the Taliban put the fear of God into, so to speak, into some people. Their assassination campaign scores a few hits in a row. Maybe they take the city of Ost and they create a sense of psychological pending doom. A lot of the elite in Afghanistan, which as you know has often dual passport situations, flees the country. You get a sense that the cities are being cut off, and it's the sort of classic age-old way in which Taliban have, you know, taken over in the past, and in which Afghanistan's governments have sometimes been challenged. I could imagine that scenario playing out if there's a sufficiently bad election, or if somehow we withdraw precipitously. Now, President Obama doesn't want to, but if Karzai really kicks us out of the cities and stops us from doing everything, and some of these disputes that we've had lately snowball, which I don't expect, but can't rule it out, then I feel the campaign plan could be jeopardized over the next couple of years. So these are all bad case scenarios, but I don't consider them unimaginably inconceivable.
Okay. Gentleman here. Let's come.
Good afternoon. My name is Adam Azim. I'm a foreign policy student at AU. And when we talk about reconciliation, my question is reconciliation with who? Because, I mean, the Afghan government, we're asking the Afghan government to reconcile with somebody. Is it, you know, Hizb Islami? Is it the Haqqani network? Is it ISI? Because if I see reconciliation as being between the Afghan government and Pakistan. Pakistan has been using the Taliban. They've been using people in Swat, the Fatah region, as sort of a, they've been using that entire Pashtunistan region as a buffer against Afghanistan. And so I think, you know, Mr. O'Hanlon says that a bad scenario is a Tajik government. I would say it's the only deterrence against a Pakistani-driven insurgency against Afghanistan and against NATO, against the Americans. So that's my opinion.
Let them comment if they will.
Very quickly, just to be clear, that I don't want to say it would necessarily be bad if a Tajik won. I don't want to sound like I'm throwing stones against Tajiks, but it does raise some dilemmas if that scenario plays out. It's unlikely, but it's not out of the question. My take on Pakistan is, frankly, that even though things are a little better in the NATO-Pakistani relationship than they were a year ago, things are still fundamentally very discouraging. The Pakistanis are basically on both sides of the war. They help us to an extent, but they want the Taliban. The charitable interpretation of Pakistan's role by Americans has tended to be they don't really think we'll be successful in the mission, and rather than have the country in anarchy and then an India-dominated group emerge as the ruler, they want to at least make sure that Pashtuns have a lot of influence, and the Taliban are therefore their backup plan. I think that's too kind. I've come to think that the Pakistanis actually want to exercise a fair amount of leverage over Afghanistan in the future under any circumstances imaginable, including through violence. And they are using the Taliban and keeping them at their disposal for that purpose. It doesn't mean they're always going to be intensifying the support for the Taliban, but they may want a group that would attack Indian interests in southeastern Afghanistan under any conceivable future Afghan government. So I worry that the Pakistanis have a sense of hegemony towards Afghanistan that is going to keep them interested in playing both sides of the fence until their basic strategic calculus changes, and I'm not sure we can do anything about it. That makes me less optimistic than I was 4 years ago about this war, but I don't think it necessarily is a fatal prescription either, because even with the Taliban of the current strength, I think there's a chance the Afghan government, again, can pick up the baton from us and hold the place together, and over time I hope the Pakistanis will accommodate that possibility and learn to live with it, even if they're not willing to right now.
Michael, do you believe that the Pakistanis would welcome, say, a Taliban military victory as a route to the kind of hegemony you're talking about, or do they have qualms about a return of the Taliban in any kind of ascendant position?
I'll be brief so Dave and perhaps you, Marvin, can comment as well. My guess is they don't want that either. My guess is Pakistanis also don't really have a clear strategy in mind, that they're sort of keeping a lot of options open, and that is essentially their strategy. I think sometimes, again, I apologize towards Pakistani friends because I have a lot, but we sometimes are maybe too charitable, thinking there's this secret Pakistani plan that they understand themselves, and that if we could just talk to the right people, they'd be honest with us, we would figure it out too. I think the Pakistanis just want to have a lot of different things in the mix, and they probably don't have a preference for a Taliban win. But they also don't have a preference for the Taliban to disappear. So they just keep it alive sort of on the back burner.
Dave?
Yeah, I would agree in many domains. In terms of who to negotiate with, that's a very good question. You know, the Taliban is essentially a confederation of different parts with different relationships. That provides an opportunity, we have thought in past years, to perhaps split elements off. Any prospects of that, again, I think are post-2014, and there are ongoing low-level discussions I've read about in newspapers, with Gelbadine, Hekmandar, and others that are continuing to dialogue with the Karzai government. Again, I think that'll be something the Afghans sort out. Reference Pakistan, I tend to agree with Mike. I think there's a four cardinal direction strategy there, that they have options in various boxes and in various directions. I don't think they have an intended outcome. I think they may be smart enough to realize that you can't create an intended outcome in that particular part of the world, and you have to be ready to hedge off whatever happens. But I would agree that having the Taliban continue to be a vibrant organization they see as being in their interests, and that I think it's very unlikely that there's going to be prospects, as I noted earlier, for a Taliban victory under most circumstances that I can think of. So I think the Pakistanis are, in a sense, going to watch and wait and see what happens here as the international coalition begins to move towards the exits.
Down here. The microphone.
Thanks. Thanks very much to General Barno and Mike O'Hanlon.
Introduce yourself.
You bet. Garrett Mitchell from the Mitchell Report. I've been thinking about what strikes me as a sort of discontinuity of sorts. Thinking about General Barno's outlining of our key strategic interests in the region, those three that you mentioned, to prevent further jihadist settlement and the spread of nuclear weapons and the Pakistan-India conflict. In what ways does the plan post 2014, as far as the United States and ISAF is concerned, suggest that we will have any or capability to affect those three strategic interests? It seems to me that if we turned it around and said, you outlined three strategic interests, then you would say, well, what's our strategy for dealing with those three? I doubt that it would be, well, let's be sure we get our troops out of Afghanistan. So I'm curious to know, if you're sitting there at the National Security Council and you say you accept that those are the three strategic interests, what hope can you give us that we are taking steps or can take steps to deal successfully with those three?
Yeah, one of the reasons I continue to bang the drum on those three is I hear so little attention being given to them, and I think that's extremely important. To include the third one, which is arguably probably one of the worst case military outcomes that could happen in the world that we live in right now, and we hear next to nothing about that until there's another Mumbai terrorist attack and we get on the brink of war again. So to the degree our follow-on presence in Afghanistan will support and protect those interests. I think follow-on military forces would clearly give you the counter-terrorist capability that you would need to reach out and touch potential threats in the region, should that be necessary, that could threaten the United States. And I think you're much better postured if those forces are in Afghanistan as opposed to being on a carrier in the Indian Ocean, 1,000 miles away. That also, if you're in Afghanistan, you continue to stay plugged into your intelligence networks that can see some of these threats. You continue to maintain a very robust capability to be able to both monitor and respond. So I think there's a lot of value on interest number one, the CT value. Counterproliferation, not so much. I think but for number two and number three, I think the value is having American forces there to add to the stability in the region. I think Americans have potential to be a stabilizing force for the region. That long-term presence signifies that the West is going to stay engaged and is not backing out and going to completely ignore what happens afterwards. So I think there's some second-order effect, if you will, for the counterproliferation value there, the influence that comes with having Americans there. I went to Pakistan twice a month, met with the senior Pakistani military and senior diplomats twice a month. That carries some weight in that part of the world that you don't get if you're flying in from Qatar, once every quarter. So I think there's some value in that, but for the counterproliferation and for the prevention of nuclear war, it's more of an indirect value. But there's a lot of other parts of the U.S. government that need to be working that portfolio that add to any military capability in Afghanistan.
Just wait for the mic. If you wait for the mic.
Nick Veliotis. Your three strategic objectives, General, if we did what this gentleman suggested, you lay out the three strategic objectives and say, how can we best fulfill these objectives in South Asia, looking ahead of strictly an Afghan-centric analysis, which I understand that's what we're here for, and it's been very helpful. You would not come out with Afghanistan as the most important element. I mean, South Asia is not Afghanistan as far as a strategic, important focus. My guess is you would come out with a two-pronged strategy. You would do your best to improve your relationships with the dominant power in South Asia, India, who shares all of our concerns about counter-terrorism, etc., because they've suffered too. And then you would make it a POC-centered policy. They've got the nuclear weapons. They're the ones who have influence in Afghanistan. And they're going to live there all the time. We're going to leave. And I'm puzzled by the thought that some American troops in Afghanistan would give us flexibility with respect to striking outside of Afghanistan against suspected terrorists. I thought the purpose was, if we were going to do that, is strike the terrorists who might be in Afghanistan. So I'm puzzled by this and worried about this as a long-term strategy. Please.
Yeah, I think that's a very good insight, and I would agree with your perception on the role of India and the role of Pakistan. And I would also note that our strategy, as I would see it for the region, isn't just military, but it's diplomatic and economic as well, and we haven't really talked in any depth about those two domains. But I would disagree with your assertion on military presence in Afghanistan, and I think I would leave it in the box of creative ambiguity in terms of what the purpose and capabilities and reach of any forces we leave behind in Afghanistan are. I had the opportunity during President Karzai's recent visit to interact with him at some length. And, you know, I think Karzai, I think he said this publicly as well, he is, you know, he at least talks to the point of being comfortable having American forces in Afghanistan to perform roles that we think are necessary, you know, whatever that means. And I think he's actually, he and perhaps his successor, perhaps not, are more reluctant to see those forces used in Afghanistan than he is to see them used somewhere else. So that again, if you're one of the neighbors, you have different views on that. But realistically, you know, the United States, as we look at the terror threat around the world, going back to that first vital interest I charted out, in the broader scheme of things, am much less worried about an al-Qaeda attack on the United States that comes from Konar province, Afghanistan, than I might be some of the other places in that large map sheet that we're talking about. So, and I have reserved the right anywhere in the world to go out and strike terrorists that threaten the homeland. If I've got convincing evidence that's going to be the case. You know, reading the newspapers, it would appear we're doing that in a lot of places in the world already. We're not doing it in most cases with people on the ground, but we're doing it in some places with people on the ground, such as in Yemen, providing, you know, advisory support as well as some other capabilities. So I'd be cautious about assuming that Americans that remain behind in Afghanistan would be only there to do things inside of Afghanistan. That would seem to me on the surface to be profoundly illogical given how we operate around the world against terrorist threats.
That would make it less likely, I think, we would be given permission to speak.
Yeah.
I disagree from what I've heard in the last 3 months.
Okay. Ambassador, another way of approaching this is to say that the stability of Afghanistan has enormous consequences for Pakistan. And so, in that sense, it can be Pakistan-centric, but that a key to the future of Pakistan and the ability to deter those extremist forces will depend on the outcome in Afghanistan. Okay, let's get another hand here. Back here.
Thank you. Bill Goodfellow, Center for International Policy. Michael has said earlier that the Taliban are not being defeated. And it's very worrisome because if our forces, NATO forces, weren't able to defeat them, I worry that the ANA is going to have trouble even keeping them at bay. I was recently in Oslo speaking with people in the foreign ministry, and they made the argument that the American military presence is an impediment to a negotiated settlement, and that after 2014, they feel that it's much more likely, and General Barno sort of suggested this earlier, that it's much more likely that there will be a political settlement. We always think of our troops as a sort of leverage to try to bring them to the table. Are we a bit more optimistic? And again, I believe that without a political settlement, that the whole effort is in danger of being lost. And how do the one thing the Norwegians said is our one job at the U.S. is to keep Pakistan at bay, but what are the prospects for a political settlement after 2014?
Bill, thanks for the thought. I'll begin. I hope Dave adds to this. I'm not going to make a comprehensive response, but I will say I agree with some of what you said, but I worry to the extent we project the view that our only hope is a negotiated settlement. And the Taliban hear that, and they already think they're holding their own, and they know we're on the way out. Why should they negotiate? I actually don't agree with the view that it's inevitable the Taliban will win, because the cities right now in Afghanistan are being essentially secured by Afghan forces already. And the most likely prognosis for what happens as we leave is that the rural areas are contested and that the cities hold. And the Afghans are already giving some validity to that argument because they're increasingly on the offensive themselves and certainly doing a lot of the holding. Kabul, you know, yeah, you have the occasional car bomb, but Kabul only had 5 big attacks last year, and Kabul is secured by the Afghans. And it's not as if the Taliban is giving up on Kabul. They're trying to attack. Now, if we pull out all of our intelligence support and all of our capabilities, they probably will be more effective for a stretch. But they're already the enemy's already being held at bay largely in Kabul, primarily by the Afghans. So let's not talk ourselves into a defeatist attitude. I think we see a lot of capability emerging here. I'm worried about it. It's fragile. It's provisional, and it's subject to political fissures from the election next year that could break the whole thing apart. But I'm not going to give up on the Afghan forces. I think they're doing pretty darn well, and they're much better fighters on balance than the Taliban. The Taliban can do some pretty potent things, but they kill people, they assassinate, and they occasionally set off a bomb. That's all they can do. The Afghan forces are actually doing maneuver warfare. So again, I don't want to dismiss everything you said, but I'd like to add a counterpoint, because I think we're at risk of, frankly, a self-defeating policy if we just say our only hope is a negotiation, tell that to the world, and get the Taliban to hear that.
Yeah, I would very much reinforce that. I think that we've probably not done ourselves a service by being as irrationally exuberant about the prospects for a negotiated settlement by the United States and the Taliban with other actors involved in the next couple of years. I think we'd be better off for the U.S. to go to radio listening silence on that topic, do whatever we're doing behind the scenes. But I actually think, to your specific question, that the prospects after 2014 are immeasurably better than they are between now and then, because then you'll have achieved a new normal in Afghanistan. You'll have a new government, you'll have a new military balance, you'll have gotten some fairly important information on the efficacy of the Afghan security forces over the next 24 months. That'll all fit into the equation and set the terms of Afghans talking to Afghans about where this is going to go. And frankly, having been around President Karzai a fair bit over the years, I've never heard him refer to the Taliban as the enemy, and I've never heard him talk as though his intent was to defeat, destroy, crush the Taliban, to lead forces in battle, to be the commander-in-chief against this Taliban menace. That's not how his mind works, and I don't think that's how the mind of many of the people around him work. So, and I have heard him talk about the Afghans in a sense as being the long-lost brothers and cousins of Afghanistan. So the dynamics of that equation, once you subtract the international military effort especially, but the international influence on that dialogue, I think are going to look dramatically different in 2 years.
Lou? Just 1 second.
What has been the lasting impact of the United States on Afghanistan? And with the benefit of hindsight, what should we have done differently?
That's an easy one. Yeah, that's an extraordinarily complex and question requiring a long answer, which I'm not going to give. What's been the benefit of the United States being there? I think opening an opportunity for the people of Afghanistan to have a different future than the one they would have had in 1999, 2000, 2001. And again, I was on a panel with Peter Bergen in New York, who was speaking about this 2 days ago, and Peter went through the chapter and verse of all the incredible success statistics in terms of, everything from the amount of paved roads, the number of Afghans that have cell phones, the size of the economy, to the number of children in school. These are multiple orders of magnitude better and different health care. The life expectancy in Afghanistan has gone up above 15 years for men and women in the last 10 years. So just some stunning improvements that would have never occurred had the Taliban stayed. So I think that's probably one of the positive legacies of the American and international presence there. Lessons learned, that's going to take us 15 years to sort that all out. A couple that I would pick out, I think from a leadership standpoint in particular, that we have utterly failed to consider the importance of continuity in our leadership of our effort in Afghanistan. We've had 11 U.S. overall military commanders in 12 years and 7 U.S. ambassadors and a clutch full of chargés in there during that same time. There's no university in the world or no business in the world that could survive that kind of leadership turnover, even if, Bill Gates was running it, and this was 11 times Bill Gates, which it hasn't been. So we've utterly failed at the fundamentals of leading a very complex war here, and that's gotten virtually no attention in recent days. 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, this has been an ongoing problem. We've had 5 commanders in the last 5 years there, and none of them had served in Afghanistan before. So that I think will be one of the enduring lessons, that you certainly cannot run a conflict that way and expect anything approaching success, and there are many others.
Just one quick thought, and I'd love to actually go back and forth with those of you who worked on this in the field in the early days. But if you all had the kind of resources that we have now, if Dave Barno in command had, let's say, 2 to 3 times the number of forces you had, way less than the surge peak, but somewhere in the broad range of 50,000 troops, and if we had had economic support to pay the soldiers in the Afghan army and the police a proper wage, to give them proper training, I wonder if in the early years, the 02 to 06 period, we could have built up a strong enough Afghan state that the Taliban would have had a much harder time coming back. To me, that's the interesting question in the spirit of what should we have done. My guess is that unfortunately, the Taliban had some time to mount a comeback before we really responded, and we hadn't done enough to build up their state in the interim because of the light footprint strategy. So if we had been more comprehensive, but in a sort of a backup role, in an advise and assist role in those years back when you were in command, to me it's an intriguing question, an intriguing counterfactual. Might that have been successful?
Let me make a quick comment on that, and I'm a bit of a fan of the light footprint, but I'm not a fan of the starvation footprint, which I think I have some experience with. So, as do some of the people in the front row here. But so a light footprint, yes. But I think if a reasonably successful, effective team could stay there 3 to 5 years in a very serious conflict where people are not only trying to make you fail on the other side, they're trying to kill you. That's probably appropriate for the seriousness of the effort to play. And we've done nothing like that. So as I was joking outside before we started, the military commanders we sent there, they've all been musicians, but we've had rock musicians, folk musicians, jazz musicians, alternative music musicians. Everyone's had a different style of music. The only commonality is they're all musicians. And we thought that would be enough, and it wasn't.
Yes, please.
Thank you so much. Ajmal Ghani from the Afghanistan Council. I want to congratulate you on a very insightful presentation, because I've watched you over the years and you guys have matured a lot, especially, seriously, especially when it comes to, hey, there. And I do want to answer your question as well, that the impact of the American involvement in Afghanistan has been incredible for the Afghans. It's just amazing. But we could have done 65% better. So that's the answer. And your insight about President Karzai is unbelievable. Of course, there's a disconnect between Karzai and the people of Afghanistan. When you talk to them, they're very pragmatic. They understand. The one thing that I think should be emphasized is the economic prosperity and the withdrawal. That has not been emphasized enough for them, and they need to understand that. But what brings me here, the biggest question is the Pakistan factor. First of all, I want to make sure that, I request that we have to stop believing that the Pakistanis represent the Pashtun rights. They've been saying that for years and all that. It has to stop. Majority Pashtuns are in Afghanistan. They have representation, so we need to talk to them. We should not listen to the Pakistanis about that. It's enough is enough. Which brings me again to the election, 2014. What do you see? Whom do you see, honestly? I know it's too early. I know we haven't started. But how do you see it? And the importance, the ambassador, unless you have a strong Afghanistan versus Pakistan, you're not going to have a balanced situation on that. So the 2014 election, how do you see it?
I'll give a quick thought as an amateur, and I hope others will correct me. Let me say I think there are 3 types of categories of potential winners. One, let's just start with sort of the lighthearted. One is the people who live in the United States. And you hear a lot of talk. I'm not going to say that Zal Khalilzad is behind it or that he's interested in running, but you do hear his name a fair amount these days. And you also hear former Minister of Interior Jalali, who's been a professor at National Defense University and living in Washington, and is well regarded. Both these individuals are well regarded. Whether this is a plausible base from which to run a campaign for the presidency of Afghanistan is a different question. Then you have the very serious reformers who sometimes are loosely labeled technocrats, but I'm not. This is the technocrats, the serious people that have a political base too and a chance to win, but also are serious about governing. And the kind of names you hear are people like Mr. Abdullah, former candidate from 2009, former foreign minister, Dr. Abdullah, I should say, and Hanif Atmar, the former Minister of Interior that many of us know. And those are the kind of people who are unlikely to be part of any Karzai-blessed ticket, in fact, almost implausible. They're going to be the opposition. Then you have the Karzai ticket. And that's the third category of possible choices. And I should break that down into 2 types, the type we can live with and the type we can't. because out of the Karzai camp, you could imagine he would try to get his brother Qayyum as the designee. That would raise all sorts of interesting questions. By some reports, Qayyum is better than Hamid at some areas of governance. I don't think we can afford to see a dynasty created, however, so I think we should strongly oppose that, at least in the next election. Qayyum's going to be president. It should be the one after, not this one. You also hear even worse people sometimes mentioned, Daoudzai, Fahim Khan, the kind of people I've talked about before, the current chief of staff as another possibility. And then you have the sort of more benign potential Karzai choices. Like one name that's being tossed around a lot is the current foreign minister, Mr. Rasool, who some people say is sort of non-political and weak enough that Karzai might feel he could sort of control him, be the godfather figure, living on the palace grounds in his own house, but pulling some of the Rasool strings, maybe even thinking about doing a Putin-Medvedev swap at some point if he could orchestrate a new constitution. In Afghanistan, you can't run ever again if you've been president twice, but maybe, or elected twice. Karzai could try to change that, because the Constitution needs change anyway. They need to have direct election of governors and mayors and things like that instead of having the president appoint all those people. So you need a new Constitution or a revised one anyway. Somebody could slip in a provision that says you can only have 2 consecutive terms as president of Afghanistan, and that would allow Karzai himself to run again in 2019. So you could imagine Karzai having that kind of a game plan and trying to get someone like Rasool, who's a great guy, but maybe relatively politically compliant to Karzai, as the designee. And you build a ticket that has some Tajiks and some Uzbeks and Hazara. That's the other big line of reasoning you hear. I'll just say for the record, I could live with Rasool compared to some of the other possibilities. I would prefer an Atmar or Abdullah. I would probably even prefer a Washington-based candidate. But those are the names that I heard the most of in the rumor mill last week.
Michael knows enough to be on the campaign of one of those as the campaign manager, so that's an impressive rundown. I think I certainly can't expand beyond that, but other than to second the idea in the lineup. I do think, as we all know, any successful slate is going to be multi-ethnic. It's going to comprise different groups and different stakeholders. And as someone has joked to me recently, we're now in the Afghan primary season. There is no primary, but this is the primary season, and this is the Afghan primary, which is the moving of these tectonic plates around to form these slates that are going to ultimately coalesce into what comes in front of the voters for next year. So I think it's going to be a sporting proposition. The U.S., I hope, will take a much more direct interest in this coming election than the abysmal lack of interest we took in the 2009 election with predictable results, because I don't think we can afford to have that happen again.
This has been such a richly textured discussion that it's a shame to have to bring it to an end, but our time has run out. There are others here who have questions. I apologize that we're not going to be able to recognize them. And join me now in thanking our speakers for a really wonderful afternoon.